On the morning of February 28, 2026, at precisely 2:47 a.m. Tehran time, the first Israeli aircraft crossed into Iranian airspace and the world changed. Not the kind of change that analysts debate for weeks before consensus forms, the kind of change that every person living through it feels in real time as a before and after moment, the kind of change that gets a name, Operation Epic Fury. Within 72 hours of the first strike, Iran had launched over 400 ballistic missiles and drones at targets across the Gulf. Within 2 weeks, the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow channel through which approximately 20% of the world's oil supply passes every single day, was a war zone. Within 6 weeks, the United Arab Emirates had announced its exit from OPEC, Qatar had expelled Iranian diplomats, Bahrain had revoked the citizenship of 69 of its own people, and Saudi Arabia was making calculations about nuclear deterrence that would have seemed unthinkable 18 months earlier. But here's what you need to understand before any of that means anything. What happened in 2026 was not a war that started in 2026. It was the detonation of a bomb that Iran had been building piece by piece, decision by decision, for 55 consecutive years. And the fuse was lit not in a military command center. It was lit on a beach on a small island at the entrance to the Strait of Hormuz on a November morning in 1971, when leaflets written in Persian fell from the sky onto Arab inhabitants who could not read a single word of them. That is where this story actually begins. Not with the missiles. With the leaflets, Abu Musa, Greater Tunb, Lesser Tunb, 3 small islands sitting at the strategic entrance to the Strait of Hormuz. The people living on those islands in November 1971 were Arabs. They belonged to the Qasimi tribe. Their families had fished those waters, grazed their livestock on those islands, and called that place home since at least the 15th century. They had been there for 500 years before a single leaflet fell from the sky above their homes. And when those leaflets did fall, on November 29th, 1971, they could not read them. The papers were written in Persian. The message was simple: surrender. Within hours, the Imperial Iranian Navy arrived. Marines under the Shah landed on all 3 islands simultaneously. 6 local police officers refused to put down their weapons. One of them, Salim Suhail Khamis, held the Ras Al-Khaimah flag in defiance. He was the first person to take a bullet from the Iranian forces. The Arab inhabitants were expelled. The police stations were demolished. The schools were demolished. Iran declared the islands Iranian territory and moved on, as though the people who had lived there for 5 centuries simply did not exist. This happened on November 30th, 1971. 2 days later, on December 2nd, the United Arab Emirates was formally established as a nation. The UAE was born into a world where Iran had already taken something from it before the country even existed. Before its flag had been raised for the first time, before a single UAE passport had been issued, Iran had already seized Arab land and expelled Arab people from it. The UAE brought this to the United Nations Security Council on December 9th, 1971, 9 days after its own founding. The Security Council deferred action. Those negotiations produced nothing. In the 55 years since the seizure, Iran refused every UAE request to take the dispute to the International Court of Justice. It sent settlers to the islands. It announced plans to build 110 housing units on Abu Musa to cement its claim. It deployed Chinese HY-2 Silkworm anti-ship missiles on Abu Musa, turning occupied Arab territory into a military platform pointed directly at the shipping lanes the entire Gulf economy depends on. In March 2026, former Dubai police chief Shia Iraqis posted something that captured in a single sentence what Arab leaders had felt for decades but rarely stated publicly. He wrote that Iran had occupied 400,000 square kilometers of Arab land, while Israel occupied 20,000. Not a diplomatic statement. A fact, stated plainly by a senior Arab official who had decided the time for careful wording had passed. That comparison contextualizes everything that followed in 2026 in a way that no amount of nuclear analysis or proxy militia discussion can fully capture. Because the wound at the center of everything that happened in 2026 is not primarily theological. It is not primarily ideological. It is territorial. It is the memory of expulsion. It is the knowledge carried across generations in the Gulf Arab states that the country standing across the water seized Arab land, expelled Arab people, demolished Arab schools, and then spent the next 5 decades daring anyone to do something about it. Now add the theological dimension. Because Iran did not just build a territorial grievance with its Arab neighbors. It weaponized a religious division that was already 13 centuries old and turned it into the most effective tool of regional destabilization the modern Middle East has ever seen. The Sunni-Shia split is not an Iranian invention. It emerged from the most fundamental question Muslim communities faced after the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632 AD, the question of leadership. Who leads? One group believed leadership had to pass through the Prophet's bloodline. They became the Shia. A larger group believed the leader should be chosen through collective consultation. They became the Sunni. That original dispute was simultaneously theological and political, and it was never resolved. For roughly 900 years, it remained largely a matter of religious interpretation. Then in the 16th century, the Safavid dynasty in Iran made a decision that changed the entire political geography of the Muslim world. They declared Iran an officially Shia state. The reason was not purely spiritual. The Safavids needed to politically differentiate themselves from the dominant Sunni Ottoman Empire on their border. Sectarian identity became an instrument of statecraft. From that moment, approximately 500 years ago, the Sunni-Shia divide stopped being a theological disagreement and became a fault line running through the entire political map of the Muslim world. Today, approximately 85 to 90% of the world's 1.8 billion Muslims are Sunni. Shia Muslims represent 10 to 15% globally, with clear majorities only in Iran, Iraq, and Azerbaijan. But since 1979, the Islamic Republic positioned itself as the protector of Shia communities everywhere, and also as the voice of the oppressed against Western imperialism and Gulf Arab monarchism. That dual framing gave Iran an ideological reach far beyond what its demographic numbers alone would justify. It was also the mechanism through which Iran constructed the network of proxy forces that Jordanian King Abdullah famously described as a Shia crescent. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, various militia factions across Syria and beyond. That network gave Iran the ability to project power across an entire region and wage wars without ever officially fighting them. The most direct embodiment of this entire dynamic is the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Two countries competing not just for regional dominance, but for something neither side will ever fully concede: the right to claim leadership of the entire Islamic world. Saudi Arabia holds Mecca and Medina, the two holiest sites in Islam. That gives the kingdom a religious authority in the eyes of the global Sunni community that no amount of Iranian proxy power can simply erase. When Iran, after 1979, began presenting itself as the authentic voice of Muslim resistance, Riyadh heard an existential challenge to the kingdom's core identity. Two countries, two ideologies, both claiming to speak for Islam. The conflict was structurally unavoidable. It became blood in 1987 when 400 people died at the Hajj pilgrimage in Mecca after Iranian demonstrators held unauthorized protests and the clashes turned one of Islam's most sacred gatherings into a killing field. It became a diplomatic crisis in 2016 when Saudi Arabia executed Shia cleric Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr and Iranian protesters stormed the Saudi embassy in Tehran, leading both countries to sever diplomatic relations for 7 years. It became, briefly, what looked like reconciliation in 2023 when China brokered the Beijing Agreement restoring diplomatic ties. Saudi Defense Minister Khalid bin Salman flew to Tehran in April 2025 and met with Supreme Leader Khamenei directly. It appeared that managed rivalry had replaced open confrontation. And then February 28, 2026 arrived and Iran fired missiles and drones at Saudi cities. The Beijing Agreement collapsed almost immediately. Whatever had been painstakingly rebuilt across 2 years of managed diplomacy was destroyed in hours. Saudi Arabia's specific existential fear about Iran goes beyond the religious competition and beyond the proxy wars, and beyond even the 2019 drone strikes on the Abqaiq oil processing facility that briefly knocked out 5% of global oil supply. The fear that keeps Riyadh's security planners awake is concentrated in a single geographical reality. The eastern province of Saudi Arabia, where approximately 10 to 15% of the kingdom's population lives, its Shia minority, sits directly above most of Saudi Arabia's oil. Saudi officials have long suspected, with documented basis, that Iran maintains active influence networks inside Shia communities in the eastern province and has systematically backed unrest there to destabilize the kingdom from within. The Eastern Province is the physical and economic foundation of Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 program, the ambitious national transformation project designed to move the kingdom beyond oil dependency and establish Saudi Arabia as the anchor of a stable regional order. Iranian strikes on Saudi energy infrastructure are not random military decisions from Riyadh's perspective. They are deliberate attacks on the Saudi economic future. And beneath all of that sits the nuclear question. Saudi officials have stated explicitly and publicly that if Iran acquires a nuclear weapon, Saudi Arabia will pursue one as well. By 2026, Iran had pushed uranium enrichment to near weapons-grade levels. The kingdom that was supposed to be building a modern, diversified economy was instead making calculations about nuclear deterrence. That is what Iran's 55 years of strategic choices produced for the region's largest economy. Iraq's position in this story is unlike any other neighboring country because Iraq is not merely a country that fears Iranian influence from the outside. Iraq is a country that Iranian influence has penetrated so thoroughly that the distinction between internal politics and external interference has effectively broken down. When the United States invaded Iraq in 2003 and dismantled the existing power structure, it removed the one force that had kept Iran contained on its western border at the cost of 8 years of devastating war and more than 1 million lives between 1980 and 1988. Saddam Hussein's state was brutal and authoritarian. It was also the single most effective barrier between Iran and the Arab heartland that existed anywhere in the region. When it was gone, Iran moved, not with tanks and soldiers, with politics, money, religious networks, and militia structures. Approximately 60% of Iraq's population is Shia. Many of the political parties and armed factions that dominate Iraqi politics have direct financial ties to Tehran and the IRGC. The Popular Mobilization Forces, the collection of mostly Shia militias that formed to fight the Islamic State, did not dissolve after ISIS was destroyed. They embedded themselves inside the Iraqi state as permanent power centers, many of them taking operational orders from Tehran rather than from the Iraqi prime minister. And the Iraqi people, including a significant portion of the Shia majority that Iran has spent decades claiming to protect, have been demonstrating in the streets against Iranian manipulation of their water supplies, electricity infrastructure, and political institutions. Muqtada al-Sadr's faction explicitly accused Iran of turning Iraq into a captive market for Iranian goods and a battlefield for Iranian wars. That accusation from Iraqi Shia people about a Shia-Iranian state describes the complete collapse of the sectarian solidarity argument Iran has been using for 5 decades. Qatar had tried harder than any other Gulf state to stay outside Iran's targeting calculations. Qatar and Iran share the North Dome South Pars gas field, the largest offshore natural gas deposit on the planet. You cannot be in open confrontation with the country you must cooperate with to extract your most valuable resource. When Saudi Arabia and the UAE imposed their 2017 blockade on Qatar, partly because Doha had been too accommodating toward Iran, Qatar leaned further into the Tehran relationship out of necessity. Iran opened its airspace and ports to Qatari aircraft during the blockade. Qatar emerged from that crisis genuinely believing that its maintained relationship with Iran was real diplomatic insurance. On March 18, 2026, Iranian long-range missiles struck Ras Laffan Industrial City, the largest LNG facility in the world, and the literal economic heart of Qatar. The attack caused extensive damage and knocked out approximately 17 to 20% of global LNG supply. Qatar Energy was forced to declare force majeure. On March 19th, Qatar declared all Iranian military and security attachés persona non grata and ordered them out within 24 hours. The State Security Service announced the arrest of 10 people who were members of 2 IRGC-linked cells operating inside Qatar. It was the first time Qatar had publicly acknowledged that Iranian proxy networks had been running active operations within its own population. Qatar's prime minister stated plainly that Iran's targeting of Gulf neighbors had been premeditated and systematic, and that it had destroyed what he called the illusion of Qatari diplomatic immunity. The country that had spent years cultivating a special relationship with Iran as protection against exactly this scenario discovered that its insurance policy had been canceled by the very company that sold it. The UAE's response to 2026 was the most strategically consequential reaction of any Gulf state, and it is the one that will reshape the regional economic architecture for decades. Iran struck the Burj Khalifa district, the Dubai International Finance Center, Jebel Ali Port, the Ruwais refinery, and the Fujairah petrochemical complex. The institutional pillars of the UAE's identity as a global financial hub and trade gateway. The IRGC justified the strikes by accusing the UAE of facilitating American military operations. The UAE's answer was not military, it was economic. On May 1, 2026, the UAE announced it was exiting OPEC. This was not primarily an energy policy decision. It was a strategic signal delivered in the clearest language available to a country that had just had its financial center bombed. In the short term, the UAE could not meaningfully increase production anyway, but the long-term implications are what Iran's strategic planners should have calculated before firing a single missile. Once the conflict stabilizes, the UAE will be free to push oil output toward 5 million barrels per day with no quota restrictions. That volume entering global markets unconstrained will structurally depress oil prices for years. For Iran, an economy already under catastrophic fiscal pressure from the costs of the war and the naval blockade of its oil exports, a post-war environment of persistently low oil prices driven by unconstrained UAE production is potentially fatal to the fiscal architecture of the Islamic Republic. Iran fired missiles at Jebel Ali Port. The UAE responded by triggering a structural collapse of the oil pricing system that Iran's own budget survival depends on. That is what strategic miscalculation looks like at civilizational scale. Kuwait had spent decades walking the most careful possible diplomatic line. Roughly a quarter of Kuwait's national population is Shia, which means that how the government positions itself toward Iran is never purely a foreign policy question. It is always simultaneously a question of internal social cohesion. Kuwait had been raided, spied on through documented IRGC networks, had multi-ton quantities of explosives seized from Iranian-backed cells inside its borders, and had its political leadership targeted in assassination plots. And then in 2026, it absorbed Iranian drone strikes that killed 4 soldiers and 6 civilians, watched its Amadi refinery struck, and saw a desalination plant damaged. The careful line did not save Kuwait from any of it. Bahrain's situation most nakedly exposes the depth of Iran's ideological aggression across 5 decades. Approximately 65 to 75% of Bahrain's population is Shia. The ruling family is Sunni. Iran has referred to Bahrain as its 14th province. An Iranian-backed coup attempt was foiled in 1981. In 2026, Bahrain intercepted more than 650 Iranian missiles and drones. Its government arrested over 200 people on charges related to supporting Iran. 14 individuals were specifically charged with espionage for the IRGC, accused of transmitting post-strike damage assessments directly to the Iranian military while attacks were still in progress. On April 27, 2026, Bahrain revoked the citizenship of 69 individuals for supporting what it called hostile Iranian acts. Iran spent 45 years attempting to destabilize Bahrain from within and then fired 650 missiles and drones at it. The country Iran had been calling its own province responded by dismantling whatever remained of the IRGC domestic network and arresting everyone it could identify inside the Iranian intelligence apparatus on its soil. Now stand back from all of it. Stand back from the islands seized in 1971, the Hajj massacre of 1987, the Abqaiq strikes of 2019, the Ras Laffan attack of 2026. Stand back from the UAE's OPEC exit and Bahrain's citizenship revocations, and Qatar's expelled diplomats and Kuwait's seized explosives in Iraq's street protests. Look at what Iran has actually constructed across 55 years of sustained regional activism. It has built a region that hates it more comprehensively, more personally, and with more historical depth than any previous Iranian enemy has ever managed to generate. Not the ordinary friction of neighboring states with competing interests. The specific, documented, multi-generational hatred of neighbors who have experienced occupation, espionage, assassination plots, infrastructure destruction, and the systematic subordination of their sovereignty to Iranian strategic calculations across more than half a century. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, Iraq. 6 nations with distinct histories and distinct grievances. All of them arrived at 2026 having reached the same conclusion about what the Islamic Republic represents. Not a rival to be balanced against. A permanent, structural, existential threat to their survival as sovereign states. And then Iran made it worse. It took every diplomatic relationship it had cultivated as strategic insurance and demolished all of them inside a single conflict it could have avoided. It destroyed the Beijing agreement with Saudi Arabia. It bombed the LNG infrastructure of Qatar, the one country that had consistently argued for dialogue. It struck the financial center of the UAE, the country whose islands it seized before that country was born. It gave every Gulf state's security apparatus the justification it needed to systematically dismantle whatever remained of the IRGC proxy networks operating inside their civilian populations. The ballistic missile stockpile Iran brought into 2026 exceeded 25,500 weapons. The scale of incoming fire pushed Gulf air defense systems to their operational limits almost immediately. The UAE and Kuwait burned through approximately 75% of their Patriot interceptor stocks. Bahrain depleted around 87%. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio approved $25 billion in emergency weapon sales to Bahrain, Israel, Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE, triple the $8.6 billion initially disclosed. The asymmetry was supposed to be Iran's strategic genius. Cheap drones and ballistic missiles bleeding Gulf states of expensive interceptor stocks, imposing financial attrition at favorable cost ratios. It was a clever design. And it failed for the same reason every clever Iranian strategic design of the past 50 years has failed. It was engineered to maximize Iranian leverage without calculating what the targets of that leverage would do once they concluded that Iran could not be deterred, accommodated, or negotiated with in good faith. Qatar accommodated for decades. Iran bombed Ras Laffan anyway. Saudi Arabia signed a formal agreement. Iran fired missiles at Saudi cities within months. The UAE maintained commercial relationships worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Iran struck the Dubai International Finance Center. The lesson every Gulf state has now absorbed is that Iran's definition of acceptable behavior from its neighbors is not friendship, not neutrality, not mutual economic benefit. It is unconditional deference. Total, permanent, non-negotiable deference to Iranian strategic interests. That conclusion, reached simultaneously by every major Arab state in the Gulf on the basis of direct personal experience, is the conclusion that makes the next 100 years structurally different from the previous 50. Before 2026, the Gulf states maintained the fiction of manageability. They signed agreements with Iran while building missile defenses against it. They negotiated while preparing for negotiations to fail. After 2026, the fiction is gone. The UAE is outside OPEC with a rationale rooted in the damage Iran did to its infrastructure. Qatar has publicly acknowledged IRGC cells were operating inside its own population. Bahrain has revoked 69 citizenships and arrested 200 people explicitly framed as a response to Iranian penetration. Kuwait has documented continuous IRGC espionage from 2003 through 2026 in official government statements. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 will need a decade to recover, and Iraq is experiencing the largest anti-Iranian protests in its history, drawing from its Shia majority, its Sunni minority, and even the portion of Shia Iraqis who have rejected the Iranian model as incompatible with Iraqi sovereignty. The nuclear dimension is what transforms all of this from a regional catastrophe into a global one. By mid-2025, Iran had pushed uranium enrichment close enough to weapons grade that the distance between threshold status and weaponization had become a matter of political decision rather than technical capacity. Full dismantlement is a line Iran will not cross. That position has converted it into a threshold nuclear state. Saudi Arabia has stated on the record it will pursue nuclear weapons if Iran acquires them. Egypt and Turkey are watching with calculations of states that understand what a regional nuclear cascade means. Once Iran crosses the threshold, the Middle East enters a proliferation cascade that 50 years of diplomacy was constructed to prevent. The region that was already the most volatile security environment on the planet becomes one where multiple states with unresolved territorial disputes, centuries of sectarian grievance, and 500 years of civilizational competition all hold nuclear weapons simultaneously. This is the 100-year damage. Not just the burned refineries and collapsed agreements. The nuclear logic that 2026 has locked permanently into place, Iran chose this trajectory. Not in 2026. Not in 2003. Not in 1979. It chose this trajectory on November 30th, 1971, when it decided that 3 small islands at the entrance to the Strait of Hormuz were worth more than the goodwill of every Arab neighbor it would ever need. It chose it every time it prioritized leverage over relationship. Every time it chose coercion over cooperation. Every time it sent IRGC cells into the civilian populations of Gulf states, it was simultaneously negotiating with in diplomatic meeting rooms. Every time it fired missiles at countries it had signed formal agreements with. The stupidity is not that Iran made one catastrophically bad decision in 2026. The stupidity is that it made the same fundamental decision in different forms for 55 consecutive years and appeared genuinely surprised each time that the neighbors it had been systematically occupying, threatening, infiltrating, and destabilizing responded the way that occupied, threatened, infiltrated, and destabilized nations eventually respond. The war that everyone could see coming, the war that every Gulf state had been quietly preparing for while publicly hoping to avoid, the war that 55 years of accumulated decisions had made not just possible but inevitable, has a name now: Operation Epic Fury. It started on February 28th, 2026. The leaflets that fell on November 29th, 1971 were written in Persian. The Arab inhabitants could not read them. 55 years later, the message has been translated into burned LNG infrastructure and exhausted Patriot batteries and revoked citizenships and OPEC exit declarations and Saudi nuclear calculations, and 100 years of accumulated grievance that no new supreme leader, no new diplomatic framework, and no amount of post-war reconstruction will fully undo. Iran did not just start a war in 2026. It finished building something it had been constructing since 1971, a region that is done with it. Permanently, structurally, historically done. And this is how it ends.